Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to our presentation today, Mergers, Acquisitions, and Divestitures in SAP Environments. My name's Ed Girders. I am the host for today's event, and the discussions, the presentation itself, will be given by John Conti. John started his career with SAP in 1991, where he was one of the first few selected to work with them on the West Coast. He started out in global logistics implementations and became the director of the SRM in Palo Alto. He is currently our VP of the SLO practice for EPI-USE Labs. Before I pass it over to John for the session, I just wanted to give one housekeeping note. Currently, everybody's on mute, and throughout today's session, if John comes across a topic that you would like to ask a question about, please feel free to type it in the question area provided for you from the service provider over on the right, and John will do his best to answer that question live at the end of today's presentation or follow up with you on the information that you need. And with that said, I am now going to turn it over to John Conti for today's presentation on mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. Welcome, John.
Great. Thanks, Ed, and thanks everybody for joining, and thanks for the intro. And as Ed mentioned, the topic today is M&A and Divestitures in SAP Environment. I've been working with and around SAP for over 23 years. Out of college, I went to Germany and I lived in Waldorf, and I was trained across the broad spectrum of SAP, and this was still in the R2 days, and also participated in the development of R3. And I've done a lot of things with SAP. I've been on the business side in terms of logistics implementations, and also became a developer and architect. And nowadays I focus on technical aspects of M&A and divestitures involving SAP systems, and I'm responsible for SLO services in the Americas. And for you that are not aware, SLO is System Landscape Optimization, and that's the overall umbrella under which M&A and divestitures falls under according to SAP's taxonomy of services and capabilities. So that's a little bit about me. I'd like to cover in today's presentation the following topics. So the overall process of M&A and divestitures. I'd like to talk a little bit about the transition phase and the TSA, which is the Transitional Services Agreement. I'd like to talk a little bit about buy-side integration approaches, and then I want to talk about divestitures, carve-outs, and the SAP data model, because that's a very important topic and very SAP-centric, clearly. And some of the buy-side integration options. We'll go to a summary, and then we'll have some Q&A. So that's our agenda for today. Okay, so let's hop right into it. Okay, so when we talk about process and M&A, there is a simplified M&A model here, where the first overall step is a target selection, search and selection. The second part is the transaction execution, and that's where the due diligence comes in and so forth. And then there's the integration phase. Now, these are very broad, and it's a complex topic involving a lot of different steps, but let's focus on the integration phase. And the areas of concern, of course, you have to look at people, your resources, you have to look at your assets, and I'm talking about the non-IT assets here. But mostly what this presentation about is the technology aspect of the integration phase. And this could be broken down into 3 sub-steps. There is a planning step, a transition step, and a transformation step. Now, again, these are simplified models, but I think you will be able to focus on the gist of the integration phase in the context of SAP. So when we look at these planning, transition, and transformation steps, we have to look at it from both the sell side, the company that's selling, and the buy side, the company that's buying. right? And the things that we need to consider are, for example, on the planning side, the sell side has to decide on how they will provide access to the buy side during the TSA, which is the Transitional Services Agreement. I'll get into a little bit more detail in the next slides. And the buy side needs to plan for the overall integration across all of the applications and systems and come up with a plan of what should happen before they actually start going live with this, and on what they expect on day 1, on week 1, on month 1, month 3, month 6, month 9. Essentially kind of building an integration roadmap that maps out the different application components and what's going to go live and what the approach is going to be for the integration. So that's the planning side. On the transition, once you've decided which approach you're going to take in terms of providing access, you actually have to do the execution of that and then actually provide the access to the buy side, right? And then at that point during the transition phase, access to the critical sell-side applications for business continuity will be provided to the buy side, and they also need to start doing the preparation for the integration. These are, depending on the scope, they could vary from a month to multi-month or year-long projects depending on the scope. And the transformation is at some point you have to terminate that transition period and actually provide the data or systems to the buy side. And this is also known as a carve-out, where you do a carve-out of that divested unit and you provide it to the buy side. And the buy side has to then absorb that acquisition into their business, right? And then they continue the execution of that integration plan. What do you do with that carve-out? How are you going to handle that data? How are you going to continue the business? So this presentation is really getting a little bit deeper into this model and looking at the different options on the sell side, the different integration options on the buy side, and talking about what carve-outs mean and what they look like and how they could be integrated and some of the pros and cons of the integration. And that's the focus of this presentation today. So I'm going to hop right into it and switch over to talk about the transition phase and the TSA. So typically we have a sell side with its own sell side network and a buy side. And a company, a buy side, might buy the entire enterprise from the sell side, or they'll buy a divested unit, a particular business unit. So we're going to be focusing more on the latter, on the divestiture side here. Okay? And part of this is this transitional services agreement, where the sell side must provide access to the acquired business during the TSA period and provide, business continuity, provide support, essentially also lease the licenses that the sell side has with the different software components, operation support. And for all of this, the buy side normally pays a monthly fee because essentially you're using the sell side system in a limited fashion based on what was acquired. And this TSA has a start period and an end period. Okay, so that's what the TSA is, right? And there are different approaches that the sell side can take when it comes to providing access to the buy side, okay? And these topics here are specifically around SAP. So one of the approaches that you can take, depending on your resource model, is that you can restrict access. So the people that are on the sell side that are also coming over to the buy side may then at that point be restricted in access point to only continue the business for, let's say, a particular company code that represents that divested part. So you can do restrict access is one of the approaches. Another approach is to actually create a new company code that reflects that divested business. Another approach that we've seen is that customers will create a new client they'll essentially do a client copy of that existing production client and a combination of access restrictions. So this way you have better data isolation with a new client. Okay. And there's other options that we've also seen, which is the carve out of the divested company code, if it's expressed as a company code, where we actually do actually extract the that carve out business and create a new system, and that is what's then provided to the buy side for access. So there's different ways that you can provide access to the buy side, right, with different resource models as well. So this is an important topic that has to be considered. Each of these have their own pros and cons. Clearly, restricting access means that you have to go to your security and authorization groups and do some remodeling of access. If you create a new company code, you're going to have to do some customization as well, and you're going to be changing your configuration, and that you need some testing and you need resources to do that, and you have to propagate that from in your landscape from dev to QA to prod, assuming a 3-system landscape. So all of these require work, and that's part of that planning and that analysis phase to decide how you're going to do this. Okay. We also have to talk about the integration part, because this actually involves both the sell side and the buy side. So during the transitional services agreement, again, typically the divested business is running on the sell side network. To provide that to the buy side, at some point you actually have to do the carve out of that data, and then you have to do an acquisition transfer where that data is carved out and then transferred across the networks and then provided to the buy side. And that's the acquisition integration. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next. Okay, so on the buy side integration approach, what do we do? So typically we have a situation where we have the source sell side. It's not just SAP. It's multiple SAP systems, an ECC system with a BW, a data warehouse. Maybe you're running SRM, CRM, but you also have satellite systems or legacy systems. And part of that carve out that you're divesting really cuts across part of your SAP system and part of some of these additional support systems that you may have. Maybe there's shop floor control systems, or whatever the case may be. And we have to somehow figure out how to take that carved out piece and integrate it on the target buy side. Right? So, how do we even go about this? Right? So the first approach is basically to take an inventory and comparison of the systems and the functions. Right? So we need to do this inventory of the business applications, of the systems, and the actual infrastructure under which these systems and these apps run on. Because it could very well be that the infrastructure on the source side, on the sell side, is different than the target side, and you're going to have to do some type of migration to make that happen from an infrastructure point of view, as well as from an apps point of view. So this is very important as a first step. On the second step, you have to decide what type of integration you're going to do on a per system, per function kind of scope. And you can boil down the different types of integration into 3. And there's variations within these. One of them is the main one is the consolidation, is where you actually consolidate 2 systems into one core system. And that you can do that in different ways. You can do that by migrating the data. You can do that by re-implementing, taking the configuration from 4.7 and re-implementing it in the 6.0 if that's your target. Right? But whichever case, when you do consolidation, you have to do harmonization. And what that means is that perhaps you have overlapping configurations, and the configurations in SAP also drives the process. So you have to decide if there are differences in how these systems have been configured, how to harmonize that into a single consistent process, and also harmonize the functions, the business functions, as well as the data. So the actual consolidation part is tricky. It takes a lot of work, but that's your ultimate goal, is to basically have it all under one system and consistent processes, consistent functions, and consistent data. So that's the first option. The second one is to have a side-by-side architecture, where essentially you are not doing any of the business level consolidation in terms of processes, functions, and data, but you have two systems that operate side by side, and you do some level of integration for this to work. And this typically means that on the buy side, you would create a new company code to reflect that acquired business, at least, and you would at least create an interface from FI, from your financials, from your sell side representation on the target, to integrate into the new company code for financial reporting purposes. So that's a side-by-side model. And then there is another model that you can is also available, but not as many people or companies take advantage of it, which is technical consolidation, where you can actually bring together two systems under one system by leveraging SAP's client architecture and consolidate things at the technical level and not do it at the business level. All of these have pros and cons, but how do you decide? You know, there's a number of things that you have to look at, and again, this is the planning phase on the buy side and the things that you need to look at. So system versions, right? You can't just migrate a 4.7 system into a 6.0 system. You might have to do an upgrade, right? So if you look at the cost and the complexity of an upgrade and then trying to do a migration, will it be not better to perhaps just do a re-implementation? So these are the kinds of things that you need to consider. You need to look at the processes and the functional usage across the two systems and the depth of the functionality being used for you to be able to do a comparison. It could be that the source side has a more advanced implementation of MM purchasing, right? And you actually want to move your target into that. So that's another consideration, right? A third consideration is the level of customizations and modifications done in these systems, right? If there's a lot of user exits, if there are actual modifications, which by now you should be avoiding as much as possible in SAP environments, you have to do the harmonization around the modifications as well. And you should also look at implementation quality. And ultimately, you know, how are you going to go about this? Do you have the integration resources, the capabilities to be able to do that integration? Because integration requires special skills, right? You have the ability to support the models, right? In other words, if you choose a side-by-side model and you don't have people that know 4.7 or have that history with 4.7, you might have a hard time supporting that, okay? Do you have the integration budget, etc.? So to do the planning you have to look at a lot of dimensions of the problem. We go ahead and move forward. And finally, you have to define some key dates. So on a per system function, you have to define what must be integrated and what the integration type you're going to approach by a certain key date. So before day 1, at day 1, week 1, month 1, 3, 6, and 9. And this essentially gives you an integration roadmap from which you can then start executing. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about divestitures, carve-outs, and the SAP data model. So to comply with the TSA, the sell side must provide divested business data to the buy side. And what does that mean? To understand that, you have to have a little bit of background on the SAP data architecture. And this is a representative system here. What you see in blue is an SAP instance. And what you see in a little bit darker blue is what we call client-independent data. So this is essentially non-business data, and it also contains the repository. So it contains the source code, the ABAP code, and contains the data dictionary, which are the data structures used by the system. There's also client-independent customizing. But the real action actually happens in this orange areas. These are called clients, and they're isolated from a data point of view. And within each client, you have customizing, which tells you how how you model your business, your enterprise in SAP, as well as the behavior of the functionality within SAP. And above that, you have master data. So you have things like your customers, your vendors, your GL accounts, your profit centers, etc. And then above that, you have transactional data. And transactional data are the transactions. So, for example, a sales order really is a container or a document that contains a relationship between a customer and your material masters, or maybe your service masters, depending on what business you're in and what you do, right? And all of these three components have interdependencies between one another, okay? And within an SAP instance, you can also have multiple clients, even though in production systems, typically most customers only have one production client, okay? But you also need to know the enterprise data model. So how have you modeled your business within SAP? And here's a simplified kind of diagram talking about some of the central components. And a lot of this revolves around what we call a company code, which is the legal entity. And within this legal entity, you can define various subcomponents. You can define sales organizations. You can define purchasing organizations. And there on the right-hand side, you can see also some of the financial aspects of it. That you can have controlling areas, financial areas, what we call operating concerns, to do the analysis from a financials, from a controlling point of view. Importantly, we also have plants on the lower side, and that's for logistics purposes. That's where things actually get built or distributed. A plant can represent different things, but originally it started out as actually a manufacturing plant, and then it evolved over time to be also a distribution center. It could also be a location for your equipment and so forth, and that's where also your products are stored. Typically, they can be linked to a warehouse. We have shipping points and so forth. So you need to understand, depending on how you modeled your business, you have to start asking yourself some questions. How is that divested business defined? Was it by business unit? Is it by division? So, across different businesses. Is it by product line? Right? And once you've defined that, you need to answer the question of how these are expressed in SAP. So if it's a business unit, is there a direct correlation to a company code or to a division? Or is the product line related to a product hierarchy in SAP? Okay. Once you have answers to these questions, right, that'll define on how simple or complex that carve-out process will be. Okay. So from the simple case is basically when you've modeled your divested company or your divested business as a company code, because a company code is really kind of the central element that holds everything together. And from there, if you do that, there is some pretty good data isolation in terms of what's possible. There might be some overlap on the controlling areas, because a lot of times companies will map multiple company codes to controlling areas. So you have some costing data that is cross-company code that then becomes a little bit harder to isolate and separate out. Okay? If, for example, you are divesting a product line, that gets trickier, because you could have a sales document that contains a sale to a particular customer that contains multiple product lines. Okay, and so how do you carve that out from an SAP system point of view? You can't simply just remove line items from that contain other business, other product lines, because that SAP document, if it's a quotation, would have subsequent documents. So a quotation could be turned into a sales order, the sales order turned into a delivery, the delivery turned into an invoice, and so forth. So it's really not tenable to just simply remove a line item from an existing document, because there's a whole document history and document flow, and you're going to break the integrity. So the way that is typically handled, or one of the ways that can be handled, is by doing some type of obfuscation of that data, or scrambling of that data, or those particular line items, which of course now add to the complexity and difficulty of that carve-out. So let's now hop on the other side of the equation. Let's assume that we have a carve-out. Let's talk about some of the integration options. I talked a little bit about side by side, so let's look at a little bit of some of the pros and cons. So some of the pros is that this is really kind of the fastest approach, because you're really bypassing the harmonization complexity. You're not dealing, when you do this, with the problems associated with the organizational challenges and some of the politics of whose process is better, which process should we adopt, and those can get those discussions can get a little complex and take time to resolve, because you typically have some overlaps and some differences, and how do you resolve those differences, and how you're going to harmonize and consolidate that. So that's the pros of side-by-side. There's several cons, right? It increases the landscape and the costs, because if you do a side-by-side, you can't just bring over the production system, right? You also need to have a QA system, and you also need to have a dev system, so that you can support the production system for operations purposes. And so now you're talking about having 3 additional systems in your landscape, right? If you do a side-by-side, you're going to increase integration points, okay? You might have also some usability issues, because you might have to go back and forth between systems to go on the divested to work on the purchased business. You have to switch systems, right? And of course, you're not getting the full level integration is not achieved. And overall, really, this is kind of a weak long-term solution. And unfortunately, this is what we see in a lot of our clients. If you look at their landscape architectures, it gets quite messy, because they acquire businesses, and all of a sudden their landscape design, or their diagrams actually look like a crazy spider web of interconnected systems. Okay. When we talk about consolidation, we talked about some different approaches of migration or reimplementation. But remember that we have to harmonize here process, function, and data. The pros here is that this is what we really want, right? It's full integration of business processes, functions, and data. We have a single landscape with lower costs, so you don't have to replicate the entire landscape, and it's really the ideal solution. Okay. The cons is that the harmonization exposes political and organizational challenges. There is risk in business disruption. To do this, you may have to also do upgrades. It also may be costly and time-consuming. It generally is. Okay. Now here's another solution that I find also very interesting. This is by using a dual client, single system approach that SAP allows you to do. And all you need to do is harmonize custom code, which is much easier than harmonizing all of the business and all of the configuration. Okay. So if you do a consolidated system level, you don't need additional landscapes. From an integration point of view, you're doing client to client, which is much simpler and cheaper, right? You have a single landscape, so therefore you have lower costs from the operations point of view and TCO. And it's a significant step towards a full consolidation, right? On the con side, you might have to do some upgrades, and the dual clients require tighter control from a change management point of view, for example, when you manage your transports into systems. Okay? Typically, as I mentioned, most companies only have one target client, so moving transports into production is pretty clear. If you take this technical approach, you have to make the changes in the appropriate clients in the landscape, because now you're doubling up the clients across your landscape to support this additional business. Okay, so to summarize, when we talk about divestitures and M&A, we talked about the sell side and the buy side, how you can do the buyout, and you have the divestiture. Right? We have the TSA and the integration steps. We can do a carve-out early on and provide access to the buy side, or we can do the carve-out during the integration phase. Okay, but ultimately, we have to provide this data to the buy side, and one of the models is a side-by-side integration. Okay. The other one is we talked about consolidation. Okay, and this is the business level integration. And I've also added here the ability to take that carve-out and provide that carved-out data as a historical system. And we've seen a lot of customers also do this, and sometimes it's for regulatory purposes. A lot of times it's for business continuity in the sense of providing support for, let's say, returns, right? So you've done your consolidation, you're actually running that business now in a consolidated environment, but for historical purposes, you might need that system to go look to see what orders were provided, a year and a half ago, so that you can do returns if that's your policy of doing returns that far back. But in certain industries, in pharma, there are regulations requiring you to have data up to 7 years back, and also in other types of industries. Okay. And finally, there is this technical integration approach that we discussed, where we take that carve-out system and we actually create a dual client environment, and we do the harmonization at the business level. I'm sorry, do the harmonization at the technical level, harmonizing your user exits, your custom codes, your reports, and so forth. So this is another option that is out there. I believe SAP also refers to this as client transfer, and this is what I'm calling technical integration here. So this is a summary, and I would be remiss to mention also that in these different points, EPI-USE Labs provides services to support our customers, and we've done this quite a few times in Europe, and we are now bringing these capabilities to the US. So just to quickly cover our services portfolio, we have mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, and also landscape optimization. But one of the things that we can do here is the company business line divestiture, carving out ERP data into a newly built system. We can do the same thing for HCM systems, or we can do it integrated. So some customers use ERP or ECC, also running HCM in the ECC system, so we have the ability to carve out both. And we can do the acquisition transfers as well into the buy-side network. We can transfer as a historical system or as a landscape. So we can build out the dev, QA, and prod systems for a side-by-side model. And we can also do the technical integration under a single instance across your landscape with a dual client architecture. And we'll also do landscape optimizations, refresh, rebuilds landscapes, and HCM decoupler, where we can separate HCM from ERP. Now, keep in mind that we are actually a product company, and our services around these are software driven. So we've built over 15 years a tool that allows us to carve out data in SAP in very sophisticated and powerful ways. So with this, I think this is a good point to pass this back to Ed.
Yes.
And then we can take a look at some questions.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great, John. Certainly, and as I kind of said from the beginning, a lot of information, a lot of great insight from your years with SAP. And I know he kind of touched everything on a high level. So yeah, I'm going to give John a minute to look at some of the questions that came in and just talk a little bit more about what John was talking about as far as our company. I know a number of you that are on the webcast today have worked with us, either customers from service or the product side. But EPI-USE Labs is a global organization. We've been in business over 30 years. We're an SAP partner both in implementations and technology. We do have those two fronts that John was talking about, services and products. That's the EPI-USE Labs portion. And what we do is we come together in projects, as John's been talking about, to make sure that the businesses, the business owners, the business users are all getting the most out of that SAP investment. And so we're lucky and fortunate enough to have John with us to work on this system landscape optimization line of business that we started. John, I know I only gave you a few seconds, but were there any questions that came out that you can discuss or you want to share some more information on?
Sure. So I see a few questions coming in here, and one of them is, what is the typical time frame for an SAP ECC carve-out? And what about side-by-side integration? So I think this question goes around the time frames. So, as I mentioned, the carve-out, it could be simple, it could be complex, right? So depending on the requirements of the carve-out and what we're carving out, maybe it's straightforward and you have a single company code, or maybe two company codes and all of the data that's related to those company codes. So all of the orders associated with the sales, with all the sales organizations related to that company code, all of the POs related to the purchasing organizations, all of the financial postings related to the company code. If that's the case, right, then it's pretty straightforward, and we've done some of these carve-outs within a month time frame, month and a half. If it becomes more complex and we have situations where we have mixed data that we have to scramble, that normally runs probably 2 to 3 months, depending on the details around the complexity of that carve-out. So the range there is between a month to 3 months to do a carve-out, right? On the side-by-side integration, and keep in mind that there's some different models there. If it's just a historical system, that might take us anywhere from 2 weeks to a month. If we need to build the full landscape, that might take, a month to 2 months, depending on the responsiveness also of our customer or partner, whoever we're working with, because they have to set up the infrastructure for that, right? We can bring the data across and build up those systems, but there's normally lead time associated with setting up that infrastructure. Okay. All right. I hope that answered the question. Okay. Another question is, somebody asks, what is a typical approach if we're also running SAP Content Server? Okay. And so SAP Content Server or other ECM type solutions, other content management type solutions can be integrated with SAP. And this is where you would store your additional documents. It could be anything from blueprints to scanned POs or orders, notifications, and so forth. And in a lot of cases, customers will have these as attachments sitting in an SAP content server. So the approach that we take there is that we actually, once we do the carve-out of the data, we put that into a new system, we do that carve-out, and in that carved-out system, we will only have the data that represents the divested business, and the pointers to the documents that are stored in the content server will come across. So what we do is create a new instance of the content server, and we migrate the documents that are relevant to that carve-out. So that's the approach that we typically take. And by the way, when we talk about carve-outs, there's two different high-level models. One is to copy the entire SAP system, the entire client, and remove things. Okay, that's one way, is to actually remove the data that you don't want. The other way is to just carve out the data that you need. Right? We at EPI-USE Labs have built tools specifically to just grab the data that you need based on filters and customizations of the extraction tool that we have. Right? Other companies will go off and try to remove everything. And that's a more painstaking approach because typically you're only divesting a smaller part, and it takes quite a bit of manual work to actually extract everything out of the systems. All right, so that was a little diversion. I hope I answered that content server question. And there's a new question here that's interesting, and this is, how would custom code work in a technical integration scenario? Okay, so in the technical integration scenario, we talked about the fact that we can take two systems, and if they're on the same release, right, we can harmonize the code base, right? We can harmonize, bring together the code base. So I think this is an interesting question because it shows that somebody really has a good understanding of SAP. Typically, a customer can, for example, extend the SAP logic by adding a user exit. Okay, and that user exit, once activated, gets invoked as part of some business function within SAP. Let's say that you are about to save a sales order. You have a user exit in the sales order to go do some additional check in a legacy system. That's possible. Okay, well, there is only, even though there are many user exits, custom code or code in SAP is unique to the entire instance, right? So the way that we harmonize custom code, if we have two systems that use the same user exit, right, what we do is we bring them together and we create a switch. We write in a simple little switch that is based on the context of the client from which it's called in. So if you are in the client that represents the sell side system that's now integrated as a client, we switch and execute the code for that particular client, and vice versa. So the client model allows us to create a very clean switch so that we can harmonize the custom code. Right? So I hope that's the answer that you're looking for. So basically, that's we can talk a little bit more in detail on the overall approach on how we do the code consolidation. But essentially, we extract the custom code from both systems, then we do a comparison, and then we do a deep analysis to figure out what can be moved across that won't cause any conflicts, and what has conflicts. And the conflicts can be at different levels. It could be based on a name. It could be based on the interface of a particular function. There are different levels of conflict that will require different approaches to harmonizations. And we've done this for several very large European clients, very, very large European clients, to do consolidations across multiple systems, and it works quite well. Okay, so these are the questions that I see here.
Okay.
All right.
Well, so if there are other questions out there, certainly a way to continue this conversation or find out more. If John kind of just touched on a topic that you wanted to pick his brain on, certainly a couple ways to get to him. There's his email address that's on the screen right now, Twitter as well. If you're in the social environment, you can tweet him, or EPI-USE Labs. I also wanted to let you know that we do go out, some of the conferences coming up, the SAP Oil and Gas, SAP Utility, and also the Tech Ed. EPI-USE Labs will be at all of those shows, and certainly can get a hold of John by coming up to one of our booths at the conference. But I think with no more questions, that I think we can conclude this presentation today. And just on behalf of John Conti and EPI-USE Labs, we certainly appreciate your time. We know it's a valuable topic that we touched on, so we certainly look forward to continuing this conversation with you again. Thanks again. Have a great day.